What if I told you that the people most likely to change the world are actually the ones who are completely terrified of failing?
Yeah, it completely flips the script on what we usually hear.
Right. Well, welcome to today's deep dive. We have an incredible stack of notes today based on Adam Grant's fascinating exploration of a concept he calls originals.
It's such a great topic for us to dig into.
It really is. I mean, we constantly hear this modern mythology, right?
Yeah.
That changing the world requires extreme risk-taking, being the first to market, and just having this loud, aggressive confidence.
The whole Silicon Valley daredevil narrative.
Exactly. The narrative is that the greatest innovators are these daredevils who just walk right up to the edge of a cliff, close their eyes, and jump.
Mm.
But today, we are going to completely shatter those myths.
Because the actual data behind nonconformity tells a very different story. Well, the reality of how original ideas take hold is far more counterintuitive.
And frankly, a lot more accessible to all of us than the legends suggest,
Mhm.
right?
Oh, absolutely. The true drivers of progress are often cautious, calculating, and surprisingly, they are massive procrastinators.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to explore why your biggest critics actually make your best allies, how pointing out your own flaws can win over a boardroom, and how you can successfully champion your own bold ideas without torching your career in the process.
It's a lot to cover, but it all starts with questioning the status quo.
Right. To be an original, you have to start by questioning the default. But questioning the default does not mean you have to be reckless about it.
It really doesn't. A perfect illustration of this comes from a study by an economist named Michael Hausman.
Oh, the browser study. I love this one.
It's brilliant. So he was trying to figure out a very practical problem, why some customer service agents stayed in their jobs longer than others.
Like employee retention.
Exactly. He analyzed data from tens of thousands of employees across banks, airlines, cell phone companies. And initially, he thought, a person's job hopping history would predict who quit.
Which makes sense.
It does, but it didn't predict it at all. But on a whim, he looked at the technical data. Specifically, which internet browser the employees used when they applied for the job.
I remember reading this part of the notes and being completely thrown.
Right.
The data showed that employees who used Firefox or Chrome stayed in their jobs 15% longer than those who used Internet Explorer or Safari.
And not only that, they missed less work, their sales were higher, and their customer satisfaction metrics were actually better.
The immediate logical assumption, at least for me, is that those employees must simply be more tech savvy.
Sure, that's what everyone thought. But the researchers tested for computer proficiency and typing speed, and that wasn't the differentiator at all.
Wow.
The difference was entirely psychological. It came down to how they obtained the browser.
Right, because Internet Explorer comes built into Windows,
Exactly.
and Safari comes pre-installed on Macs. So almost two-thirds of the customer service agents just used the default browser handed to them. They never questioned it.
But to get Firefox or Chrome, you have to demonstrate a tiny bit of resourcefulness. You have to actively reject the default option, go find an alternative, and download it.
That tiny act of initiative is actually a massive window into how a person approaches their entire environment.
It really is. The agents who simply accepted the default browser also tended to accept the default script on their sales calls. If they were unhappy with their workplace, they just accepted it as a fixed reality.
They just missed days and eventually quit.
Exactly. But the Firefox and Chrome users, on the other hand, actively looked for novel ways to fix problems. If they didn't like a situation at work, they tried to improve it.
They effectively engineered the jobs they wanted, which is why they stayed longer. It makes you wonder how many areas of our own lives are running on Internet Explorer mode, where we just, accept the default because it's there.
That's a great way to put it.
Which brings up an interesting point about child prodigies. We always assume the kids who are playing Mozart at age 4 are the ones who will change the world, but the data shows they rarely do.
It's a fascinating paradox. Child prodigies learn to play the game perfectly. They can execute magnificent classical pieces, but they rarely go on to compose their own original scores.
Because they spend their formative years conforming to codified rules and seeking the approval of adults.
Yes. They become what the research calls excellent sheep.
Excellent sheep, wow.
Their motivation for achievement gets so high that they become utterly terrified of failure. They want guaranteed success, so they stop trying to be original.
But let's contrast that with the people who do break the mold, the successful entrepreneurs. There's this pervasive myth that to build a billion-dollar company, you have to have skin in the game.
Oh, the classic drop out of college story.
You have to max out your credit cards and risk everything. But the founders of Warby Parker, the massive eyewear company, didn't do that at all.
They kept their day jobs and worked internships while getting the company off the ground.
And Bill Gates. He didn't just impulsively drop out of Harvard. He took an approved leave of absence and had his parents bankroll his living expenses. Stephen King worked as a janitor and a teacher for years after his first story sold.
And the broader economic data backs this up entirely. A massive study tracked thousands of Americans who transitioned into entrepreneurship.
And what did they find?
The ones who kept their day jobs while launching their ventures had 33% lower odds of failure than those who quit their jobs to go full-time right away.
I love how this flips the traditional narrative.
Hmm.
It makes me think about like a tightrope walker.
Okay, how so?
He is keeping a day job while starting a business, essentially like having a safety net under the tightrope. Because it seems like having that net actually gives you the psychological freedom to try much bolder, more innovative tricks.
Because you aren't terrified of falling to your death. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is exactly like that. It's about managing what economists call a risk portfolio. When you embrace extreme danger or novelty in one domain, like trying to disrupt the eyewear industry, you offset that risk by exercising extreme caution in another domain, like keeping your steady paycheck.
So originality isn't about jumping off a cliff blindfolded.
Not at all. It's about tiptoeing to the edge, meticulously calculating the descent, and making sure you are wearing a tested parachute. Having financial security gives you the freedom to not publish a half-baked book or rush a flawed product to market just to pay your rent.
That makes so much sense. So if balancing risk is what keeps you in the game, the next hurdle is figuring out which of your ideas is actually worth pursuing.
Because you're going to generate a lot of noise.
Right. Once you start questioning defaults and brainstorming from the safety of your day job, how do you know if your original idea is actually any good?
The short answer is you don't. In fact, you are probably the absolute worst person to evaluate your own ideas.
Really, the worst.
We all suffer from confirmation bias, but for creators, it is especially blinding. When you generate an idea, you experience the physiological rush of the eureka moment. You are too close to it.
Like Beethoven, right?
Right.
He couldn't predict which of his symphonies would be hits.
Exactly. Picasso drew 79 different sketches for his masterpiece, Guernica. And historical analysis shows he didn't even know which variations were the best as he was creating them.
So the only way these historical giants arrived at quality was by producing a massive, almost absurd quantity of work.
You simply have to kiss a lot of frogs.
Shakespeare wrote masterpieces like Macbeth and King Lear in the exact same 5-year window that he wrote Timon of Athens, which most critics consider one of his worst plays.
And Thomas Edison gave us the light bulb, but he also patented a truly terrifying talking doll that flops spectacularly.
Okay, but this raises a practical question for anyone listening. If we can't trust our own judgment, shouldn't we just take our ideas to the experts?
Yeah.
Like managers, executives, or maybe run a focus group?
You would certainly think so, but the research shows managers and focus groups fail just as often as creators do. They just fail in the opposite direction.
The opposite direction.
Take the Segway, for example. When it was pitched, Steve Jobs called it the most amazing piece of technology since the PC.
Jeff Bezos predicted it would have no problem selling.
John Doerr pumped $80 million of venture capital into it. They forecasted a massive, world-changing hit, and it was a total commercial flop. That is a classic false positive.
And the reason it was a false positive is that Jobs and Bezos were digital pioneers. They completely lacked experience in physical transportation, and they got seduced by the sheer passion of the inventor.
But then you have the inverse happening in the entertainment industry. Look at the sitcom Seinfeld.
A false negative.
Exactly. When it was first pitched, test audiences and network executives absolutely hated it. The pilot was rated incredibly weak.
They said it lacked the heartwarming family dynamics of The Cosby Show, right?
Yeah. That is a massive false negative for what became the biggest show on television. The Seinfeld example perfectly captures the danger of what psychologists call being prisoners of prototypes.
Prisoners of prototypes.
When managers or test audiences are asked to evaluate an idea, they immediately shift into an evaluative, critical mindset. Their brains automatically compare the new idea to old templates. They look for reasons it won't work based entirely on what has worked in the past.
It's like, okay, judging your own idea is like judging your own child singing in a school play. You're biologically wired to think it's a flawless masterpiece.
Right.
But a focus group is like bringing a classically trained opera critic to that same school play. They're going to measure it against Mozart and tell you it's terrible.
That is a brilliant way to look at it.
So if creators are too biased and managers are too conservative, who on earth do we ask?
The optimal judges of new ideas are fellow creators operating in your domain. A researcher named Justin Berg conducted a fascinating study with circus performers.
Circus performers.
Yeah. He found that the circus artists were terrible at predicting the success of their own acts, and the circus managers were too risk-averse and rejected anything too avant-garde.
But when fellow circus artists were asked to evaluate each other's acts,
Their predictions were incredibly accurate. Fellow creators aren't blinded by the ego of having made the thing, but because they are artists themselves, they remain open to novelty in a way that managers simply aren't.
which is exactly why Seinfeld survived execution. The executive who finally championed it, Rick Ludwin, did not work in the sitcom department.
He worked in late night, variety, and specials.
So he had enough deep foundational experience in comedy to recognize why a show about nothing was actually hilarious, but he had enough broad experience outside of the traditional sitcom formula to not be trapped by its rules.
That combination of depth and breadth is the sweet spot for evaluating originality.
Okay, so you've bypassed the conventional managers, you've relied on your fellow creators, and you finally have an idea that the consensus says is genuinely brilliant. But you still have to sell it to the people with the checkbooks.
The gatekeepers.
Right, and the traditional advice on how to pitch an idea seems to be completely backwards.
It is, and it's a lesson Carmen Medina learned the hard way during her time at the CIA. In the 1990s, the intelligence community was highly siloed, relying on daily printed reports. Information was hoarded.
So Medina saw the early internet and proposed something deeply radical for the time-sharing intelligence instantaneously across agencies over a classified internal internet.
The reaction from her superiors was brutal. They basically chased her out of the room, arguing that the internet was the ultimate threat to national security. She kept pushing her idea aggressively, and it almost ruined her career.
The notes mentioned she had to take sick days just to recover from the stress of the shouting matches.
Yeah, the structural mistake she made was trying to exercise power without having earned status. In any hierarchy, if you try to exert influence but lack widespread respect, what sociologists call idiosyncrasy credits, the immune system of the organization will attack you.
Idiosyncrasy credits. That's essentially the leeway you earn by proving you are a valuable, reliable member of the group, right?
Exactly. Because Medina hadn't built up enough of those credits, she hadn't earned the right to deviate from the CIA's deeply entrenched expectations.
But she didn't give up. Years later, she actually succeeded in helping create Intellipedia, which is now a massive internal wiki used across intelligence agencies.
She did it by first taking a very conservative security job to earn those idiosyncrasy credits. But more importantly, she completely changed how she pitched.
Which brings us to a fascinating entrepreneur named Rufus Griscom. He was pitching his parenting startup, Babbel, to Disney.
But instead, Griscom opened his pitch with a slide literally titled, "Here's why you should not buy Babbel."
It's a phenomenon known as the Sarek effect. He stood in front of Disney executives and methodically listed the biggest flaws and risks of his own company. He told them why it might be a terrible investment. And Disney ended up buying Babbel for $40 million.
Yep.
Okay, I have to pause here. Because that sounds like going on a first date, sitting down at the table, and immediately handing the other person a printed list of your most toxic traits and past relationship failures.
It does sound crazy.
Doesn't doing that just give the executives the exact ammunition they need to reject you?
It feels like it should. But what's fascinating here is if we explore the psychology of that first date analogy, what actually happens. If you lay out your flaws up front, your date instantly relaxes.
They think, okay, this person is highly self-aware, they are honest, and they aren't trying to trick me. I don't need to be on guard.
The exact same cognitive shift happens with investors. When you pitch a novel idea, the audience naturally has their shields up. They are waiting for the slick salesman routine. By leading with your weaknesses, you completely disarm their defensive posture.
You shift the dynamic in the room from a combative sales pitch to a collaborative problem-solving session.
And it actually makes you look significantly smarter, too.
There was that brilliant study mentioned in the sources where participants read book reviews. When the review was scathing and highly critical, participants rated the reviewer as 14% smarter and more competent than when the review was glowing and positive.
Yes. By pointing out the flaws in your own idea, you prove to the investors that you aren't blind to the risks. Furthermore, by listing the top 3 problems yourself, it makes it cognitively harder for the investors to think of a fourth or fifth problem on their own.
Wow, that's clever.
There is another psychological hurdle to pitching, which is the curse of knowledge, often demonstrated through the mere exposure effect. When you are pitching your original idea, you have been living with it for months. You are intimately familiar with every nuance.
But your audience is hearing it for the very first time.
That brings up the famous tapping study. If I ask you to tap the rhythm of the song Happy Birthday on a table, you will naturally assume the listener has about a 50% chance of guessing the song.
Because I can hear the melody playing perfectly in my own head while I tap.
Right. But in reality, the listener only guesses the song 2.5% of the time. Because to them, without the melody in their head, it just sounds like bizarre, disconnected Morse code.
Exactly the same disconnect happens with a pitch. You are hearing the symphony of your grand vision, but the investors are just hearing tapping.
Research shows you have to expose audiences to a novel idea 10 to 20 times before they fully process it and become comfortable with it.
So you can't just pitch once and walk away frustrated. You have to introduce the tune, let it sit, and repeat it.
Exactly.
Winning over the room with your flaws and repeating the tune is a brilliant psychological maneuver. But here is where the innovator's impulse usually steers us off a cliff. The moment the gatekeepers say yes, the instinct is to sprint.
Oh, absolutely. Conventional business wisdom screams about the first mover advantage. You have to execute before someone else steals the idea.
But the data says rushing is a massive mistake.
This brings us to the profound power of strategic procrastination. Let's look at one of the most famous moments in American history. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech.
He didn't even start writing the actual speech until 10 o'clock the night before the March on Washington, right? Hold on, I'm looking at this note here, and a part of me is wondering, where is the line between strategic incubation and me just playing Minesweeper on my phone to avoid doing actual work?
That's a fair question.
How is putting off a speech for a crowd of 250,000 people a good strategy?
It comes down to a psychological mechanism called the Zeigarnik effect. The Zeigarnik effect is our brain's tendency to remember and fixate on incomplete tasks far more than completed ones.
Ah, I see.
By intentionally putting off the finalization of the speech, King kept the task active in his subconscious. His brain maintained a state of cognitive tension, leaving him open to divergent ideas and associations he wouldn't have made if he had finalized the draft a week earlier.
Because the speech wasn't locked in stone, he retained the flexibility to improvise.
And that flexibility changed history. When the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouted from the crowd, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," he was able to push his prepared notes aside and organically wing the most famous segment of the speech.
If he'd rigidly memorized a finalized draft, he might have ignored her.
That is the vital difference between laziness and incubation. You have to start thinking about the problem first. You have to put the pieces on the board. Only then does stepping away, even to play a game like Minesweeper, allow your subconscious to process those pieces.
If you rush to finish, you freeze on your very first, most conventional thought. And this translates directly to business and the myth of the first mover advantage.
Completely. We worship pioneers, but the data shows pioneers actually fail 37% of the time.
47%.
And settlers, the companies that wait and move late, fail only 8% of the time.
Look at the dot-com boom. A company called Cosmo rushed into 1-hour internet delivery. They scaled prematurely, burned through their cash trying to educate a market that wasn't ready, and went bankrupt.
Conversely, Nintendo waited, watched the early video game consoles make critical mistakes, and then entered the market to dominate it.
Warby Parker deliberately waited to launch until consumers were actually comfortable buying items like shoes online before they tried to convince them to buy prescription glasses online.
Moving first is merely a tactic. It is not a goal in itself. Settlers get the incredible advantage of watching the pioneers make all the expensive mistakes. They let the pioneers educate the market, and then they step in to improve the technology and offer a better product.
That concept of pacing is deeply tied to how individuals innovate over the course of their entire lifetimes, isn't it?
Yes, and this was one of the most reassuring parts of the research. We have this cultural obsession with the young genius.
These are conceptual innovators like Albert Einstein. They sprint. They have a massive, purely theoretical breakthrough early in their 20s.
But the downside is they often peak early because they become trapped by the very paradigms they invented.
But there's a second life cycle of creativity, the old masters. These are experimental innovators like the poet Robert Frost or the author Mark Twain.
They treat their work as a marathon of trial and error. They don't conceptualize the end result in advance. They figure it out through experimentation as they go.
Because their originality is built on accumulated knowledge and sustainable tinkering, they peak much later in life. So if you haven't changed the world by age 30, you aren't out of time. You might just be an experimental innovator.
Exactly.
So you've incubated the idea. You've avoided the pioneer trap. You are ready to build. But you cannot build a massive movement or a new company in a vacuum. You need a coalition. How do you gather allies without alienating people along the way?
The first step is recognizing a deeply counterintuitive sociological trap called horizontal hostility.
Horizontal hostility.
We naturally assume that sharing common goals unites people. But in reality, having similar goals often drives groups apart due to a phenomenon Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of small differences.
The women's suffrage movement is the perfect historical example of this. You had Lucy Stone, whose approach was somewhat mainstream and measured, and you had Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose approaches were much more radical.
They all wanted the exact same ultimate outcome voting rights for women. But instead of uniting, the movement fractured completely.
And if we look at the psychology behind the narcissism of small differences, we see why. When a radical group and a mainstream group share a broader goal, the radical group feels their unique, pure identity is being threatened by the compromises of the mainstream group.
So vegans will often argue more viciously with vegetarians than they will with people who eat meat. To protect their identity, the radicals attack those closest to them.
Anthony and Stanton ended up forming alliances with highly controversial figures just to differentiate themselves, which severely alienated the general public.
Lucy Stone realized that to actually win, she couldn't rely on ideological purity. She needed allies outside of her echo chamber.
Which leads to one of my favorite tactics in the notes, the Trojan horse strategy. Frances Willard was another suffrage leader, and she wanted to convince conservative temperance workers, women who were fighting against alcohol abuse, to support voting rights.
But these temperance workers were highly traditional. They had no interest in radical gender equality.
So Willard didn't argue for equality. She reframed the concept of the vote entirely. She called it a home protection ballot.
She argued that if these women truly wanted to protect their families from the devastation of the saloon, they needed the political power to vote against it. She smuggled a deeply radical idea inside a highly familiar conservative value system.
We see this in modern tech, too. Meredith Perry founded a startup called U-Beam, with the goal of beaming electricity through the air using ultrasound. When she tried to buy the parts, every acoustic expert told her it was physically impossible and refused to help her.
So she stopped telling them why she wanted the parts. She stopped pitching the radical vision. Instead, she just went to the engineers and asked, how do I build a transducer with these specific acoustic parameters?
By making it a standard engineering puzzle, they built the parts for her. She became what the researchers call a tempered radical.
But I have to push back here.
Oh, okay.
Doesn't hiding your true motives or smuggling your vision like pureed vegetables inside a kid's mac and cheese contradict all the modern leadership advice we hear today?
We are constantly told to be transparent, to start with why, and to lead with authentic purpose.
This raises an important question about the limits of transparency. Complete transparency is highly effective when you are executing established goals that everyone already agrees on.
Right.
But when your idea completely shatters the status quo, leading with your radical why triggers an immediate cognitive defensive wall in your audience. To get a highly original idea accepted, you have to blend the extreme novelty with something deeply familiar.
Oh, like The Lion King. When the writers originally pitched the concept to Disney executives as Bambi in Africa with lions, the executives hated it. It felt too weird and disjointed.
But when a producer reframed it and said, no, this is Shakespeare's Hamlet with lions, suddenly the executives immediately greenlit it.
They anchored the extreme novelty of the setting to a deeply familiar, proven narrative template.
Exactly. And as you build these coalitions using familiar templates, you also have to be very careful about who you invite into the tent. We tend to think our best bets for allies are our frenemies.
The people in our network who sometimes support us and sometimes undermine us, we figure it's better to keep them close.
But the biological data on this is wild. Studies show that dealing with ambivalent relationships frenemies actually causes more physiological stress, more workplace absence, and higher resting heart rates than dealing with consistent enemies.
Wow.
When you interact with a known enemy, your brain knows exactly what to expect. You put your shield up, but you never know when a frenemy is going to hug you or stab you in the back, and that unpredictability exhausts your nervous system.
So Lucy Stone was completely right to distance herself from Anthony and Stanton's erratic frenemy-style behavior.
The research suggests your best allies are actually your former enemies. If you can take the time to convert someone who used to vehemently oppose your idea, they become your most credible advocate.
They already know all the counter-arguments. And psychologically, they have to work very hard to justify their change of heart to themselves and others, which makes them incredibly fiercely loyal.
Let's pull all of these threads together.
Yeah, becoming an original doesn't mean you have to be a reckless, impulsive, fast-talking rebel who drops out of school and alienates everyone in the room.
It means carefully balancing your risk portfolio.
It means relying on your creative peers, not just yourself or out-of-touch managers, to judge your ideas.
It means having the psychological confidence to pitch your own flaws to disarm your critics.
It means resisting the urge to sprint, waiting for the right moment, even if it requires strategic procrastination, and having the emotional intelligence to smuggle your radical ideas inside familiar Trojan horses.
And as we wrap up, there is one final critical piece of this puzzle to mull over. When we find ourselves facing a broken system or a flawed default, we essentially have two choices: exit or voice.
Exit or voice.
Taking the exit path means leaving the situation entirely. Donna Dubinsky chose exit. When Steve Jobs wouldn't listen to her warnings about supply chain issues at Apple, she eventually left the company and went on to help pioneer the smartphone revolution elsewhere.
Exiting can be an incredibly powerful way to preserve your own originality and find a place where your ideas are valued. But the tragedy of the exit strategy is that it leaves the broken system perfectly intact for everyone else left behind.
That is precisely the dilemma, and that is why the alternative voice is often so much harder. Carmen Medina chose voice. She stayed at the CIA. She endured the shouting matches, the stress, and the career setbacks.
She patiently spent years earning her idiosyncrasy credits so that she could eventually transform the intelligence community's culture from the inside out.
Leaving a broken organization to start your own thing is widely celebrated in our culture. But perhaps the ultimate act of originality isn't dropping out to build something new. Perhaps it is having the immense patience, the strategic tact, and the courage to stay, use your voice, and fix a broken system from within.
Think about the defaults in your own life today. Consider your workplace, your creative projects, or your community. Where are you just accepting the Internet Explorer version of reality because it's what was handed to you? You don't have to jump off the cliff blindfolded today to change it. Just tiptoe to the edge, look down, figure out your strategy, and make sure you've got your parachute strapped on tight. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.